Hello, I'm Suzie Hanna, and I'd like to thank Helen Dewberry for inviting me to speak at this event. I apologise for not being here in person. The title of this short presentation is Poetry Animation, Visual Symbolism, Representation and Materiality. I'm not a poet, I'm an animator. I create poetry films from historical and contemporary sources. And this short presentation focuses on an example from each category. As you may already know, the word animation derives from the Latin animatus, which means to breathe life into. Poetry comes from the Greek poiesis, to make, create or give form to. And this for me already promises some potential synergy between the two forms. As an animator and a tutor, I've employed creative strategies from both disciplines for many years. Examples include an exercise from a book called Poetry in the Making by Ted Hughes, which he wrote in 1967, in which the reader is encouraged to describe an object with microscopic attention, extending associations in all directions while keeping the object as an anchor. The poet claimed that to engage with these multiple electrical connections would enhance powers of perception and creative description. In another book called Do-It-Yourself Animation, written by Bob Godfrey in 1974, he follows very similar lines in an exercise that involves imagining possibilities in development of narrative and character design through focusing on an object. He suggests changing the scale, sound, colour, purpose and environment, as well as the creation of parallel descriptors. These are similes that can lead you to consider appropriate metaphors. A peacock and a firework may have a lot in common, for instance, such as loud noise, sudden display, beautiful luminescent colours. As an animator, maybe I don't have to paint a peacock if it's mentioned in a poem. A firework could be a really good substitute. These exercises encourage creative risk-taking through engagement in a journey from the actual to the possible by individuals' development of symbolism, juxtaposition and substitution. Poetry and animation both use highly compressed forms to convey bigger stories, so finding a visual key to unlock the layers is crucial. I'm going to talk about creation of visual aspects of poetry animation, as I don't have time to do justice to sonic content that is clearly as important or more important. But I would like to emphasise that I work alongside sound designers and that our development of our strategies and parallel symbolism is truly collaborative. I have actually written about this in an article which I'll post you a link to. So whether creating animation for poems by dead poets or collaborating with live ones, thorough research is always required in the service of ethical and authentic representation. I'm going to take two examples from my own practice to explore similarities and differences in regards to visual symbolism, representation and materiality. In all cases, close reading of the poem is absolutely essential, detecting clues as to how the poet has communicated the meaning of a poem. First example is a poetry animation I completed in 2013 called Proem to Brooklyn Bridge. It's the first poem in Hart Crane's epic work, The Bridge, which was an iconic work that took the modernist romantic poet 10 years to write, publishing it in 1930, only 2 years before his tragic death. It's a portrait of America framed through the device of the Brooklyn Bridge, which was the poet's favourite piece of architecture, about which he writes ecstatically in diverse contexts. As an unwilling advertising copywriter, Harold Hart Crane was a master of extremely condensed phrasing. His notebooks reveal an obsession with collecting words and short phrases. Close reading of the poem reveals a consistent use of oxymorons. These create dynamic tension. From the very first line, the reader is given a vertiginous ride in an inviolate curve, which rapidly continues with rippling versus rest, shedding versus building, chained versus liberty, elevators versus drop. You're lifted up to a bird's eye view of the bay and the Statue of Liberty, and then you're moved from dawn to night, but not in a linear narrative style. The visual reference is monochromatic. White is the only colour referred to by name in the whole poem. So I had to do a lot of research, reading biographies, poems, letters. And as a visual artist, I looked at the New York painters' work from that period, most of whom Hart Crane knew. So Oscar Blumer, Marston Hartley, Joseph Stella and Adolphe Cassandra's poster styles and his typefaces. Particularly Adolphe Cassandra, his depiction of urban and engineered objects, boats, bridges, trains, resonates with Hart Crane's subject matter. The poet admired the writings of Wyndham Lewis as well, and I felt that vorticist imagery resonated with his poem, pared down shapes which promoted an intrinsic and unsettling vertigo. So these all influenced my choice of what you might call an ideographic style. I experimented with stencils and I used Brooklyn Bridge and photographs of Manhattan and Brooklyn from the 1920s as a starting point. I had to simplify that imagery in order to animate it, and I overlaid stencils and created what I would call visual oxymorons, where space and form, positive and negative, could start to work together in what I hoped was a poetic image. There was a texture afforded by this technique, which I also thought resembled the materiality of the bridge, the stonework, the iron, the steel, these kind of slightly rough, sort of flat surfaces with a kind of roughness. Animation's a temporal form, and the overall shape of the film also needs to be planned. And for this, I was inspired by something called motion graphs. Motion graphs were kind of invented by Oscar Fischinger, who was an animator in the 1930s. So I made one of these, and it helped me to understand the shape of the poem and therefore plan this kind of movement between the heaven of the bridge and the hell of city life. The hell of suicide. There's a suicide in the poem where somebody jumps into the river, which was a common practice from the very, building of the bridge. Many people have jumped from it. And this gave me this kind of choreographic plan for the film, which was based on the shape of the journey of the poem. I created a visual style which was reductive, which I felt simplified, the simplified aesthetic of New York modernism. You could kind of see a parallel between them. And used a palette which was suggested by the poem. I cut over 1,000 stencils, painting through them under the camera. And this is a kind of repetitive meditative practice. And that is the weirdest aspect of animating poetry. You take a highly compressed form of words, expand it through a very time-heavy process, and you experience the poem, in a way, in extreme slow motion. And then it's recompressed into the experience of watching the film. So that's a kind of summary of poem. And I'm going to try and do a similar one of a poetry animation I made 3 years later, which I've written about in some detail for the International Journal of Film and Media Arts. Again, I'll provide a link. There's some overlap here between what I wrote and what I'm saying. There was something in 2016 called the Fierce Light Project, which was commemorating the centenary of the Battle of the Somme. And I was commissioned to make an animation in collaboration with the New Zealand poet Bill Manhire. He sent me the poem, which was written as a series of epitaphs for dead soldiers, unknown soldiers. And I will read this explanation that he sent me of his process. He said, the starting point for me was the headstones in northern France that simply say, known unto God. It's clear that a soldier of the Great War lies beneath the ground, and it's often clear what his nationality is, but the name is gone entirely. Hence, I've given 11 of them a brief, quick piece of self-description, though not their names. The 11th section references skateboarding on the monument in Wellington of the New Zealand unknown warrior. So this became a magnet for late night skateboarders, which was a fine new object for doing jumps. The last 3 sections are set in the contemporary Mediterranean and are the single voice of maybe an 11-year-old girl who's speaking or thinking the words. I've left it unclear as to whether it's she who drowns or her parents or maybe all 3 of them. So his comment about poetry films generally was thus, when I asked him was there any advice he'd like to give me? He said, "The only thing I hate in poetry films or when poems are set to music is relentlessly direct illustration. When they say a bird is mentioned and we have to see a bird flap across the scene, or hear a flute making bird calls. I'm all for a complementary relationship between the various elements, and I'm happy if the relationship sometimes resists explication." So he left me with a very free canvas to work upon. I'll go through a few small aspects of the process, which was that the Imperial War Museum gave me access to photographs of battlefields, the distressing effects of trench warfare. I studied artists from the period again, Paul Klee, Paul Nash, Otto Dix. I read about the exploitation of the New Zealand Maori soldiers who were put on permanent trench digging duty. I read soldiers' accounts of the war, and I was very affected by a couple of things. One was Dan Todman's descriptions of photographs of the battlegrounds, where he went into deep analysis of what mud was at the time. I'm not going to read all of it because it's a bit too long, but what he said about the mud was that it was made up of excrement, dead soldiers and animals, shrapnel, barbed wire and the remnants of poison gas. For all the opportunities it offered to bacteria surrounding splintered trees and dead men, it seemed opposed to nature. The mud bears a terrifying potential to engulf the soldiers who struggle within it, to suck them down, spluttering, choking, drowning, to convert their corpses into yet more mud. My own grandfather had suffered from being in the trenches at the Battle of the Somme, and he suffered from frostbite and enteritis on those battlefields. And it really destroyed the rest of his life in many ways. So I decided to draw into mud and pigment under the camera and to make separate responses to each of the epitaphs. These described a whole life and death, sometimes in as little as 2 short lines. I don't have time to share the whole poem or all the detail of process, but I will just give you a few examples of the epitaphs and the decisions I made about representation and symbolism. The beginning of this poem, Known Unto God, starts with this epitaph. Boy on horseback, boy on a bicycle, boy all the way from Tolaga Bay, blown to bits in a minute. This first verse establishes the innocence and youth of the conscripts. It hints at their long journey across the sea to war. Horses pulled heavy guns, transported weapons, carried the wounded and dying, and mounted cavalry charges. More horses than men died at the Battle of the Somme. So I started at the sea, at Tolaga Bay, transformed the beach into a battlefield, and it gave me the opportunity to show the boy in both locations simultaneously. I looked at Otto Dix's powerful images of dead horses, but those capture a static aftermath, and the poem is active. So one of the challenges from the outset was to keep an animation moving when the poem is all about death. I'll just choose 2 more examples. My last letter home turned out entirely pointless. I wrote whiz-bang a dozen times to try and say all the noises. My response was that scrawling shapes of barbed wire are as incomprehensible as the victim's handwriting, a metaphor for pointless battles. David Jones, in his poetic record of the First World War, in parenthesis, describes a shell-shocked soldier endlessly rearranging matchsticks. And here the poet captures the same condition with great economy. I'll just use one more example. This is about a Maori soldier. Not all of me is here inside. I built Turk Lane before I died. Kia ahatia. Kia ahatia means so what? And like the pointless letter, the sacrifice of war seems devalued. I experimented with all sorts of things here, animating the shoveling figures, men's shadows disappearing into the mud, but I thought that a game of cards with clear symbols was a better option. The Jack of Spades is a blackjack, the Maori soldier. He's a man laid in a coffin. He's trumped by the ace, maybe by the hand of fate. Bill Manhire liked my poem film here. He said, I'm very happy. He said that I enlarged the text and that some other filmmakers might have reduced it or limited, made it single-minded. I realised that much of my research and rationale for the development of visual symbolism, representation and materiality is lost on an audience who see the animation fly by. This won't stop me from finding great pleasure in the approach that I take to both the detail of meaning held in the poem and the physical creative process of working with it in order to explore the synergy between the forms. I hope that makes some sense to you. And as I say, I'll put some links to any further reading that might be useful if you are interested. Hope you have a lovely day. Bye.